begin with a passage from the Gospel of Matthew, the 11th chapter, and the first 19 verses. A longer passage, but that burns up some more time, so I'm going to do that. After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John heard in prison what Christ was doing, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else?" Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight. The lame walk. Those who have leprosy are cured. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. And the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me." As John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. "What did you go out into the desert to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No. Those who wear fine clothes are in kings' palaces. Then what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, 'I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.' I tell you the truth. Among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet, he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing, and forceful men lay hold of it. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you're willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. He who has ears, let him hear." To what can I compare this generation? They're like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling out to others, "We played the flute for you, and you didn't dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, 'He has a demon.' The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, 'Here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.' But wisdom is proved right by her actions." This is the word of the Lord. I open with a short prayer. Through the written word and the spoken word, may we know your living word, Jesus Christ, our Savior. Amen. I've been living with the question of greatness for a long time now. Not my greatness, obviously, but the question of how we understand what this means. I'm getting ready for a conference this very weekend in Grand Rapids, Michigan. At the conference, I'm going to give a paper on the question of greatness and humility in the context of the classroom. How is it, this conference asks, that we inculcate virtue in the classroom? How is it that we teach in such a way that, as Christian professors, we encourage virtue from our students? Well, some months ago, I presented a proposal that had to do with greatness and humility, and then had many months to realize that I'm not sure what I'm going to say. That's still true, and I do the paper on Friday. Still true, and I'm doing this now. So I'm not sure I understand exactly what greatness is the more I've pushed at it, because the more I looked, especially at the record of the Gospels, the more I discover statements that I find difficult to understand. Relentlessly upside down. Completely counterintuitive and bafflingly topsy-turvy statements about greatness that I find very difficult to process. How is it the least of you shall be the greatest? In what sense is the greatest the least? There's this strange dialectic, one flowing into the other, that Jesus calls us to over and over and over in the Gospels. And the more I think about it, the more difficult I find that to understand. Especially when Jesus puts it like this: whoever wants to be the greatest must be the servant of all. So if I want to be great, is that a good thing? Should I desire that kind of greatness that leads me to be the servant of all? It's a very difficult question. And for my conference paper, I'm asking this as a professor of history. How is it that I approach the question of greatness there? Because history, for the most part, is about people who have attained some sense of greatness. How is it that I can help us follow Christian humility while teaching about people who were so much praised, I suppose, by their own generation? There have been different approaches to that. If we went back 100 years or so, we would find that one approach to teaching history was to try to find greatness, to look for people who were particularly great and to hold them up, not only as the people who guide history, but also as the people we should view as our exemplars. I quote Thomas Carlyle at this stage, a great 19th century Scottish philosopher. Carlyle said this: "The history of the world is but the biography of great men." The biography of great men. And when Carlyle set out to write a big multi-volume history, that's exactly what he did. He found people that he regarded as great for whatever reason, and he would put them in as the fulcrums on which history would bend. And there's something to that. Our own age has a rather different tack. In the same way, we also hold up greatness, but we hold up greatness usually in order to undermine it. If you study later 20th century history, we have a great delight in pulling down the figures that Carlyle held up, pointing out their faults and their foibles, finding the feet of clay and smashing them to watch these people fall down. It's strange to me that in both cases, whether we're looking back a little farther or a little more recently, we have this sense of greatness as something that's a little impenetrable. Either it's these people we have to almost worship as heroes, or it's people, on the other hand, whom, by not being perfect, we pull down. And in both cases, I think we get it wrong. And so this leaves me with the conundrum. How do I then approach teaching history if I see in this a concept of greatness at odds with the gospel? A lot of the kinds of greatness that Jesus talks about, after all, are things we don't see. The acts of greatness that are accomplished by those taking the part of servants, following Jesus' example, washing the feet of his disciples, they don't get written down so much. It's hidden history. So I don't have the option as a teacher of looking for greatness in that respect, because it's just not usually written down. And so I'm left more confused than ever. There are certain people, of course, that get the title great. As we look back at history, here's a few. If you go to Wikipedia, by the way, and look up lists of people with the title the Great, there are a lot of people you've never heard of, which is itself rather telling. A lot of them there. Xerxes the Great, from ancient Persia. Alexander the Great, from ancient Greece. Charles the Great, from the ancient Frankish. We know him as Charlemagne, Charles the Great. Alfred the Great, to whom I'll return, of England. Otto the Great of Germany. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great of Russia. Now, these are a list of people. The reason they get it is generally because they rule other people. In general, this is a title that obtains if you have some sense of dominance. And clearly here I have problems. I also insert here, and I apologize in advance for this, my lone gag for the day. What do Winnie the Pooh and Alexander the Great have in common? The same middle name. Thank you, 4 people. I appreciate that. It's a great joke. So we have a sense culturally, too, of glorifying achievement. It's not just in the teaching of history that we look for greatness. We see this a lot, and Facebook is a good example of where we see our tendency to want to exalt greatness. One of my former students is a big extreme runner, and his news feed flooded my news feed for about a week with this guy doing a record time on the Appalachian Trail, a guy called Scott Jurek, who accomplished this remarkable feat of finishing the Appalachian Trail in record time at tremendous physical cost. He was ill on the way. He looked horrible. It just looked like a terrible experience the whole way through. And yet this was held up for us as greatness. That's the kind of thing that we tend to exalt. And we like to put it out there on Facebook and other media. With myself, my Facebook presence is almost exclusively my children. One friend of mine says that I curate my children on Facebook, which is probably true. Now, I only put up things that I find amusing or interesting. I don't put up things like last night, and this is true, my son woke up about 4 times. It's not a particularly great thing to put up, and so I leave that off. When I put things on Facebook, it tends to be things that I regard as laudable or praiseworthy. I just completed this week as well a self-evaluation form. As a faculty member at King, we're all expected to do this every fall. We write an evaluation of ourselves. How well do we teach? How well do we serve the institution? How well do we serve our community? Dr. Han Ong is going to have the joy of reading mine this week, and he's going to find that I'm a combination of C.S. Lewis, Abraham Lincoln, and Mother Teresa. He may start referring to me as Martin the Great by the time he's done. I didn't put a lot of stuff in that form either. I left some things out. So we have a concept of greatness that is not just there as history teachers, but it's cultural. And I'm still left wondering, how do I square that? I want to celebrate achievement. I want to celebrate good things, but at the same time, I keep looking at these words that say, the one who wants to be greatest among you should be the least. For many years when I've taught, I've tried to help students gain a little bit of sense of perspective on the past with an image, and I'll throw that image out at the moment. I also was going to bring a physical example of this, and of course I forgot. But you can imagine it. Imagine, if you will, that I have behind me, there, a mirror. Most of us are used to mirrors. We spend time looking in these things. And if I turned around and I looked in my mirror, I would see myself in great relief. And what I would see is all of you all as tiny, tiny little things behind me. Little specks dotting the landscape in the wake of my great figure in the front. And what I say, when I use this image in class, is that history, understanding history, is a matter of turning around. If I really want to do history well, I need to pull myself around from the mirror toward the past and see these people in proper perspective. They're not minuscule compared to me. They are my equals. Now, on the one hand, what this does is it helps me from becoming to stop being self-obsessed, to stop putting myself in this great relationship of towering over the past. It also allows me to see that I am of the same stature as Charles the Great, Xerxes the Great, Catherine the Great. They have the same kind of stature that I do. And so what I've hoped that image gives us is a sense both of our own need for humility and our own potential for greatness. And I've liked that image. I've used it a lot, and yet I'm not sure it works. I'm not sure it still gets to the heart of the difficult teaching on greatness in this text today and many others from the gospel. You can't read them and be comfortable. The text itself starts with John the Baptist in prison. John, of course, had proclaimed that Jesus was the coming Messiah, had baptized him in the Jordan, had a ministry that got him into trouble. He denounced the wickedness of Herod, and he found himself in prison. And from prison, John the Baptist sends his disciples to go off and ask Jesus, "Are you really the coming one?" And Jesus' response is to send back and say, "Well, here's what's happening." Now, in the course of this discussion, Jesus then is going to turn to the people around him and talk a little bit about John. And he talks here about greatness. John is already a strange choice for what Jesus has in mind. He says this, "Among these born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist." Now, many times when you go to commentaries, they'll focus on the fact that John is here regarded as the greatest prophet leading up to Jesus. But in fact, that phrase simply says no one greater, period. And this is somebody who already should throw us off. John the Baptist, after all, rules no kingdom. He wrote no book. He wore camel's hair and ate locusts and wild honey. He spent a few years in the desert preaching before he finally got imprisoned and eventually beheaded, his head brought on a platter to King Herod. So already to choose John as the greatest of all, I'm sure it was about to explode, but I'll go first. The first will be last. In that case. If either of my children were here, they could tell you what note that was. There we go. Actually, that was Vicky Faye's way of telling me to wrap it up. It's really subtle. I appreciate it. The other option is just to feign sleep, as the rest of you are doing. So already John's a strange choice. In what sense is John the greatest person ever born? This prophet in the wilderness. So already we have some of that sense of the upside down kingdom. And yet, Jesus goes farther. The one who is the least in the kingdom is greater than he. So what in the world does this mean? If the least in the kingdom is greater than the greatest ever born, how do we understand this sense of greatness? And what do we learn from it? What makes it even a little stranger is that throughout this passage we're seeing John getting it wrong. John, the greatest of all the prophets, John, the greatest ever born, has actually gone back on his initial recognition of Jesus as Messiah and is now having second thoughts. Are you really the Messiah? So even John, even this great prophet, has his flaws, has his feet of clay. Even John, maybe, falls into the trap of understanding greatness the way the world understands greatness. And so, in Jesus' response, we get some comments about greatness, and they don't necessarily answer my question, but I hope they put us on the way. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing. That is often translated has been dealt with violently. It's a very different reading of that passage. Those in the kingdom are very often carried away with violence. Of course, John had been. He's there waiting for his own execution. It's a little irony, actually. Jesus says, did you go out in the wilderness to see a reed shaken in the wind? Did you go to see someone in soft clothes? No, those in soft clothes are in the palaces of kings. Well, he knows that that's where John is. It's just that John is in the prison of a palace. So here's a different understanding of greatness. Greatness, to be in the kingdom, to be the least in the kingdom, is to be greater than John the Baptist. And the kingdom itself is dealt with violently. The kingdom of heaven, in other words, is something that advances through the things that Jesus had listed earlier. The blind receiving sight, the lame walking, those with leprosy cured, the deaf hearing, the dead raised, the good news preached to the poor. And verse 12 gives us that kingdom being dealt with violently by those who do dominate, by those who seek to rule others harshly. We have a very strong sense here that the kingdom of heaven is one thing, and the kingdom of this world is another. Very much as St. Augustine lays that out for us in his famous City of God. Now, this famous teaching doesn't seem to have stuck with the disciples either. Only 7 chapters later, in Matthew 18, they're arguing over who's the greatest in the kingdom. Not having gotten the point, apparently, here they continue to argue who is the greatest. And yet again, Jesus tells them the same thing. If you want to be great, you must be the servant to all. In fact, the way he words this in chapter 18 is interesting. He says, the disciples asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Jesus called a little child and had him stand among them. And he said, "I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Whoever humbles himself as the child. In a sense, everybody in the kingdom of heaven is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. The question is, how do you get in? How do you enter this? How do you participate in that kingdom? The kingdom in which lions and lambs lie down together. Children play with the adder. So we have a sense here, I think, that greatness consists in Jesus' conception entirely in humble service and in participating in a kingdom. It's not our own greatness, but it's a borrowed greatness. It's greatness of participation in his kingdom. In fact, I want to offer a different reflection image. If the mirror is a good image for understanding ourselves in relation to others, I think our relationship to the greatness of Christ is to understand a rather different reflection. Think about the reflection of the moon. Last night, you couldn't see the spectacular moon a couple of nights ago because, of course, it was cloudy. But if you were out last night, you saw a pretty remarkable moon. You saw it in full relief, glorious in its near fullness as it begins its slow wane. And the reason you saw that is that the light of the sun was illuminating it. And that's the reflection, I think, that Jesus is calling us to here. A reflection of himself insofar as we participate in his kingdom, and that's what makes us great. Otherwise, we're unlit objects out there, not reflecting anything particularly glorious, and insofar as we seize greatness, it's something we grab for ourselves. The borrowed greatness of Christ, for those of us participating in his kingdom, that's what we're after. I left in the last section here because it's interesting to me, this image of children, and curiously, Jesus using children both as a good example of entering the kingdom and also as a bad example here. Children in the marketplace complaining that neither Jesus nor John has done what they want them to do. We played a dirge for you and you didn't mourn. We played a song. We played the flute and you didn't dance. It turns out that those who pursue the greatness of the kingdom don't do what they're expected to do. What the world asks of them is simply not the relevant question. And I think that image of the children in the marketplace, dissatisfied with Jesus and John, gives us that in full relief. So what do I do as a history teacher? I'm not sure. How is it that I try to present an account of history in which these invisible moments of borrowed glory show up most fully? How is it that I recognize these shards of reflection of the greatness of Christ, whether in somebody who's well-known or somebody who's less well-known? How do we make that seeking for the kingdom the focus of our study? I'll leave you an example. One of the greats I gave you earlier, Alfred the Great, the one you haven't heard of. I'm trusting you've heard of all the rest. But Alfred the Great was king of the kingdom called Wessex in modern England. He spent his career fighting the Vikings who were trying to take over England, eventually successfully staving them off, carving out a little kingdom for himself and making peace. More than that, in fact, converting the Vikings. Viking King Guthrum will eventually convert to Christianity. Now, Alfred is remembered as the Great, and yet the story that almost any English person knows about Alfred is this. When he was on the run from the Vikings, he found himself alone and in a swamp in the wintertime. He had to find shelter, and he found it in the home of a swineherd and his wife, there in a swampy bog area in southwest England. During this winter, alone, apparently defeated, Alfred took shelter with these people who apparently didn't know who he was. They gave him shelter. They acted in a very kingdom way by keeping this man. One day, the wife had put in some cakes to bake into her oven, and she went out on an errand or two in the swamp, whatever one does for an errand in the swamp. And she left Alfred, and she said, I want you to take out these cakes when they're ready. Alfred the Great, forgot. The cakes burned. And the woman came back and she scolded him. You come here and eat our food, she says, but you can't even, you're too lazy to watch the cakes. Now, instead of reacting violently, Alfred receives the rebuke, continues to live among them, and according to a couple of versions of the story, learns how to bake at this stage. Now, that to me is one of those little breakings in. That's a little breaking in of the kingdom. And as I look at Alfred the Great, and I certainly want to look at his other accomplishments if I'm teaching early medieval history, I want to focus there. Because there I want to say I can see the reflection of Christ. And that ultimately is what leads us to greatness. Thank you.